Hi everyone, we are lined up for a really interesting study today. We are talking about Psalm 45. I barely fit this one on the outline. We've got a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get into it. You can download the PDF at tobelikechrist.com. My face is not here today, so it won't be in the way to cover all of the text that we have to cover. Let's talk about the author. Once again, as with the last chapter, the sons of Korah, who were a family of the tribe of Levi, the authors of Psalm 45. We do have a New Testament reference, one that's really important, one that we'll talk about at the end of our study, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. We have two themes today. Number one, a glorious king worthy of praise. And number two, a beautiful bride worthy of admiration. And then for our definitions, we have three. Maskil appears again in verse 1 as it did in the previous study. The exact meaning of this term remains unknown. Some people think it was a musical indicator. Other people think the term indicates psalms that were written to impart wisdom to the people who were hearing them. And then also in verse 1, we have this phrase, according to lilies. And this is how the psalm is described in the introduction. This is another unknown term, and again, some people think it refers to the musical instrument that was being played, and others think it was a designation to mark the fact that this is a particularly beautiful psalm, and it really is, as you'll see in our outline, or hopefully you've already read it. And then the last definition, gold of Ophir. This appears in verse 9. Now, Ophir is the name of a place. It was likely the name of a region rather than a city, but nobody knows exactly where it was. Some people think that it was in Arabia, India, Africa, the Philippines. There's all kinds of theories. So basically, I gave you three words. I can't define any of them with any specificity, so hope that helped. Okay, so that takes us over to our outline section. There's a lot going on here. There's so much more that you can get into than what we can get into in 5 minutes or 7 minutes or however long this takes me. But just know, this is a psalm that you can really dig into, and there's a lot of depth to it. There's a lot of interesting conversations and debates around it. So let's, just with that introduction, let's talk about it. This is a psalm about a king and his bride. Now, the specific king is not named. Some people think it's Solomon. Some people think it's, David or something. There's no name anywhere in the text. We don't know. But it is clear from Psalm 45:6 and Hebrews, this is in the New Testament, Hebrews 1, 8 and 9, that this psalm has a prophetic meaning which was fulfilled in Jesus, the Messiah, which, if any king of Israel or Judah the psalmist had in mind when writing this, remains a topic of debate. Okay, so we don't know who this king is, but it definitely has a prophetic meaning in Jesus. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So the first section is a description of this great king. And then the second section is a message to the king's bride. So let's talk about verses 1 through 9, in awe of the king. The first section of Psalm 45 extols the greatness of this king in question. The psalmist wrote that the king was more handsome, more beautiful than any other man. God blessed the king with splendor and majesty by pouring out his grace on him. The king would saddle his horse to go out and fight, and he fought for these great virtues of truth, meekness, and righteousness. And his enemies were not in any way comparable to him in battle. Now that takes us to verse 6, which is, in my opinion, the key verse of this chapter. Verse 6 is the key verse because the psalmist refers to the king as God. He uses that term, saying, quote, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your righteousness is a scepter of uprightness." We do have to do a little bit of interpretive work here, don't we? And, this isn't something we get into a whole lot in these 5-minute studies, but it's kind of necessary here to figure out what's going on. How can an earthly king be described as God? This is the Hebrew term Elohim, I believe. Some scholars, so here's one opinion, some scholars suggest that the author described the king as God, not to say that he's divine, but because as a divinely appointed ruler, the king shares in some of the attributes of God. Okay, and there are some other passages in the Bible where this term Elohim is in some ways applied to men, and some of these scholars point out these other texts. That's a whole nother study that we cannot talk about in 5 minutes, much less 50 minutes. So if you're interested, you can dig into that. So some people are saying he uses this term God to refer to the king because he shares in some of God's attributes in the fact that he's a divinely appointed ruler. Okay. Now, other scholars, here's the other opinion, suggest this psalm has nothing to do at all with any earthly king of Israel or Judah that lived, back during the time of the united or the divided kingdom, back during the books, of 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. They say it has nothing, this psalm is purely prophetic. It is a description solely intended for Jesus. In which case, the title of God is not problematic at all, because Jesus is God. It's also a good proof of the fact that Jesus is divine himself. But they say, no, this psalm is solely intended about Jesus, and we should not be looking for some kind of king of Israel and Judah that we can apply this psalm to. I have to be honest, that's the interpretation that I lean towards, although I'm certainly not going to be dogmatic about it. I haven't studied it as much as I want to. Okay, so those are the two ideas. Now, whoever this king was, the text says that their throne was going to be established forever, and they would rule with a scepter of righteousness. And there was an honored queen, which I think is the bride that we're about to talk about, who's standing at the side of the king in splendid gold array. So now let's talk about this bride and the instructions that are given to her by the psalmist in verses 10 through 17. The psalmist turns to, he's not describing the king any longer. He turns to address this woman, this bride, and he offers her guidance on how to have a blessed marriage. He advised her to let go of her loyalty to her own people and to give herself wholeheartedly to her new role and to her new king, her husband. She was to submit to the king and bow to him. As queen, she would receive many blessings based on her relationship to the king. Foreign nations would court her favor. She would be glorious, the text says, in robes of gold, and she would be blessed with sons who would become princes. Now, the psalmist concluded with one final blessing, writing, quote, "I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations, therefore nations will praise you forever and ever." So here we have a description of a great king and a great bride who is subject to the king, but in her own way will be made glorious by God. Now, that takes us to our last section, which is not technically an application section today, but it's an interpretation section, I guess. We're going to talk about the parallels, the interpretive parallels between Psalm 45, King Jesus, and his bride, the church. So whether or not you think Psalm 45 is describing an earthly king of Israel, one thing that there's no question about is that Psalm 45 is prophetically pointing and describing Jesus, at least in part, because the author of the book of Hebrews connects the psalmist's words in Psalm 45:6 to Jesus. Now, I'd encourage you to go over and read Hebrews chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. You'll see a quotation from Psalm 45. When you look at the whole of Psalm 45, the parallels between the king and Jesus and the king's bride and the church are quite striking. So I want to close today talking about the parallels between Jesus and the king and the church and the bride of Psalm 45. And you can do much more work on this psalm if you have time. It's really a great one. Okay, let's talk about Jesus and the king first. Jesus is a glorious king who fights for truth and righteousness. That's according to verse 4. He is more beautiful than any of the sons of men, according to verse 2, not in physical beauty, but in character. His enemies are no match for him. We see that in his death and his resurrection, his ascension. He's rightfully called God, And his throne is an eternal one. Jesus is king now, and his throne's going to last forever and ever. That's why he's the perfect king. He never has to be replaced. He can never be corrupted. He is God sitting on the throne, and it's an eternal throne. He is also the anointed one. That concept comes up in verse 7 of Psalm 45. Do you know what Christ means? We say Jesus Christ. Christ means anointed. So like this king, he is anointed, and he loves righteousness and he hates wickedness, as is described in verse 7. So those are just some of the parallels between the Psalm 45 king and Jesus. Now let's talk about the bride. Who would the bride be? Maybe you're familiar with some of the language in the New Testament. In regards to the bride, the church is talked about as the bride of Christ in the New Testament. Ephesians chapter 5, Revelation chapter 19, 2 Corinthians chapter 11. The church is beautiful to Jesus, as this bride is described in verse 11. So beautiful that he gave his blood for it. As the church, we are to forget our past loyalties and to give ourselves wholeheartedly to our King, just as the bride was in verse 10. The church will produce princes, as was promised to the bride. These are adopted sons of God. See Romans chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. And the church will exist through all generations, and people will praise its existence forever and ever until the Lord returns. That in parallel with what we read in Psalm 45, verse 17. All right, so that's just a little taster of what you're getting in Psalm 45. And again, if you have more time, definitely study it for yourself. It's definitely worth it, and let me know your thoughts if you have any, and whether or not you have a personal interpretive opinion on whether or not this refers to an actual king of Israel or Judah or not. All right, well, I think that's enough for today. Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow to talk about Psalm 46.